Okay, we're starting chapter 3, and our first lesson, this is going to be part 1, the cell cycle and cell division. And the part 1 is basically dealing with the cell cycle. Part 2 is going to deal with the cell division. Now here's the big idea. How can one cell become a multicellular organism? Because think of it, every single one of us began as one cell, all of us, and that was created at conception. And so you had the sperm uniting with the ovum, producing what we call a zygote, which is the first cell that we all began as. From that one cell, we became trillions of cells, and we're going to see how that happens. And then in our part 2, we'll talk about, well, how do these different cells then, that are first of all the same, how do some of them become a bone cell? How do some of them become a heart cell, heart muscle cell, and so on? That'll be the next one. Okay, so the key concepts. What are the phases of the cell cycle, and why is the result of the cell cycle important? I like this graphic. It's not in your book. I got it off the internet, and it really is a good picture, a visual of the cell cycle and all that's going on. Most cells in an organism go through a cell cycle of growth, development, division, and it's called the cell cycle. Now, lots of things, as we talked about, goes through a cycle in their life, a phase. Think about the cycle that our seasons go in. They affect certain organisms, such as a tree. There's many trees that are affected in the fall where their leaves start changing colors, and then eventually by winter time the leaves fall off. And then in the spring they start budding new leaves and so forth. And so that's a cycle that takes place year after year, where our cells are going through a cycle as well, year after year. Through the cell cycle, organisms grow. Remember, growing is producing more cells than are dying. They develop, and the develop means they will become specialized, like a cell would become a nerve cell in your brain, or a cell would become part of your muscle in your leg. It also is for replacing old or damaged cells. And, key thing, for growth, we've got to have the production of new cells. And so no organism can grow if we can't produce new cells. And also no organisms can produce new offspring if they don't have the ability to produce new cells. Okay, there are two main parts to the cell cycle, and these phases are called interphase and the mitotic phase. And today we're focusing on the interphase part. Interphase is the period during which the cell cycle of a cell's growth and development, most of the cell's life, is in interphase. I mean, it could be years in interphase, depending upon the type of cell. During interphase, most cells go through 3 stages. There's the rapid growth, and rapid growth, of course, would be after conception, where you're one cell. You are going to go through a lot of rapid growth to develop into the little baby. There's replication, which we'll talk more about that. The copying of the membrane-bound structures called organelles. The copying of the DNA, that's the focus, getting ready for cell division. And then there's also the preparation for cell division, some other things that have to take place. The interphase occurs in 3 stages. They call it the G1, the S, and the G2 phase. And you can see the cycle up there, talking about what's being accomplished and what order they go in. The G1, it's right as it's listed. G1 is first, then the S phase, and then the G2 phase. In the G1 phase, the period, this is what it is, it's the period prior to the making or the synthesizing of DNA. In this phase, the cell increases in size, in mass, in preparation for the cell division that's going to occur later. Now notice where the G comes from and represents gap, and the 1 represents the first gap. So G1 is the phase in the first gap phase. S stands for synthesizing, which is making. So it's the period during which DNA is synthesized or made. And in most cells, there is a narrow window of time during which DNA is synthesized. So this part of the phase does not take very long in comparison to the rest of the phases. And then the G2 phase is the period after the DNA has been made, but prior to the start of cell division. The cell synthesizes proteins, of course where? In the ribosomes, and it continues to increase in size. Note that the G in the G2 represents gap and the 2 represents the second. So the G2 phase is the second gap phase. Now the length is interesting because it differs for different cells and in the same organism. So your brain cells and your bone cells will not necessarily go the same length of time to go through a cell cycle. Here's showing you some differences. Early frog embryos takes 30 minutes to go through a complete cell cycle. Yeast cells takes 1.5 to 3 hours. Intestinal epithelial cells, those are the cells that line your intestines, takes 12 hours. Mammalian fibroblasts in culture take 20 hours. And our own human liver cells take 1 year. So this is just showing you don't need to memorize these times or anything. This is just showing you the length of the cell cycle varies depending upon the type of cell. And then in our next lesson, we're going to study more about what happens in cell division and some of this preparation that has to occur during the cell cycle to get ready for cell division.